Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. In the latest development, Turkey has agreed to what it describes as a 120-hour pause in its military offensive in northeastern Syria after what US President Donald Trump said was a ceasefire agreement following a meeting between President Erdogan and US Vice President Mike Pence and US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Trump, at a rally in Dallas, cited it as his great deal-making and unconventional. He likened the military push to the fight between two kids in a lot. Sometimes you have to let them fight a little while, right? Sometimes you have to let them fight. It's like two kids in a lot. You got to let them fight and then you pull them apart. That is the direct quote from what President Trump said at the rally. The deal appears to secure Turkey most of its military objectives, forcing America's one-time allies in the fight against ISIS Kurdish forces to cede a vast swath of territory. A U.S. military officer told the U.S. channel CNN that the deal meant the U.S. was validating what Turkey did and allowing them to annex a portion of Syria and displace the Kurdish population, unquote. To discuss the situation, we are joined by Dr. Mark Meirowitz. He specializes in Turkish foreign policy, U.S.-Turkish relations, and Turkish-Israeli relations, joins us from New York. We are also joined by Vakkas Dogantekin, who is the chief correspondent of Anadolu Agency's English desk, joins us from Ankara. And we are also joined by Furqan Yagmur, who is in Urfa and essentially on the ground. So let me begin with Mr. Yagmur. Mr. Yagmur, can you give us a sense of what the situation on the ground is?
Well, the fighting for the time being has stopped. There's only small clashes in the town of Rasulayn. At this point, we don't know what the reasons are. These might be small terror cells, but on the ground, the situation seems to be working in the favor of Turkey. Turkey has gotten everything it's asked from the Americans. It has a 440-kilometer border, safe zone border that goes in 30 kilometers deep, which the Americans are now guaranteeing that the YPG will evacuate within the next 3 to 4 days. And what's more interesting is once this evacuation time is finished, Mr. Erdogan will be meeting Putin. So we'd have to wait and see what the Russians are going to say as well to be able to make more comments on that.
Okay, Mr. Yagmur, tell us if this was going to be ultimately the outcome, then what really happened in August? There was this deal. Essentially, the U.S. wanted to avert this offensive, and the U.S. and Turkish militaries had agreed to set up a security mechanism on the Syrian side of the border, an area that would be free of the YPG fighters. But there was the nomenclature was not, quote unquote, the safe zone. Now, this is essentially what has happened, but somehow that didn't work out, and President Erdogan on 6th October said that, Turkey will go in militarily. Why did the earlier August deal did not work out?
Well, actually, the term safe zone has been used by President Erdogan for a very long time now. He's been saying he wants a safe zone on his border. And why that didn't work was because the Americans kept stalling. They were not able to convince the YPG to evacuate these areas. Then Erdogan decided to start his operation. With the start of the operation, Turkey, I think, showed what it can do to the YPG without American backing. There was, in a week, there was over 706 terrorists killed. And this led to the YPG making a deal with the Russians, basically, or you can call it the regime, which then brought Americans back into the table, which really worked in the favor of President Erdogan because he now got everything he wants without having to fire any more bullets.
Okay. Now, saying that the YPG pulls back and the safe zone is created, the next step would be, as Turkey has been saying, that they're going to resettle the Syrian refugees on Turkish soil in that safe zone. But it also assumes that Turkey will have to keep some military presence there because it's unlikely that the Syrian National Army could actually man the area or actually hold it.
Yes, this is true. So To answer this question, we can look back into Turkey's previous two operations, Operation Euphrates Shield and Operation Olive Branch, which liberated the Azaz area from Daesh and the Afrin area from YPG. What happened after these operations is the Turkish military stayed to, basically make sure that these civilians are under protection. And the Turkish government built infrastructure, schools, and many more things for the civilians there. These areas have become the safest parts of Syria. So if the YPG pulls back and Turkey manages to, get this safe zone, the next step will be to build infrastructure, schools, and, basically send back the refugees to these areas where they can live safely. And the Turkish army will be guaranteeing that.
Okay, thank you, Furqan. Yagmur speaking with us. Dr. Meirowitz, let me theorize here a bit. It seems to me that while President Trump thinks that his kind of strange letter clinched this deal, it appears to me that it's actually President Erdogan who played this rather nicely because he looked at the Americans and said, well, I'm trying to get you guys to accept this, but you're dithering, and so I'm just going to go in, and once I go in, then you will come running to me, and then you will ask us or get us a deal which will get the YPG out of this area. Is that correct? I mean, am I getting the sense of this right?
I think there's a bit more to it, and we have to look at the domestic situation in the United States. So, for example, the 12 points of the agreement that was reached between Turkey and the United States promises that it will not impose sanctions under the executive order. However, the Congress is talking about sanctions, meaning that this deal is not wrapped up. If Lindsey Graham can get a 2/3 plus majority in the House and the Senate, he will impose sanctions which President Trump cannot veto, number one. Number two is the deal is not a final deal because there's a lot of other parties here, Russia, Iran, the Syrian regime. They didn't agree to this. And frankly, the United States wasn't really in Syria, in that area, to enforce the deal. They kind of got out. And then, as you said correctly, I think, the president spoke to a rally, to his base, and told them that this was just about a fight in the sandlot about a bunch of kids, and then sent a letter to President Erdogan, which is a first in diplomacy. It's going to go into all the textbooks on diplomacy. Extraordinary letter, which President Erdogan said he threw in the trash, or which a diplomatic representative of Turkey said it's null and void. What is going on here? Chaos and confusion. And if I may, Ejaz, I will say this is all about impeachment, the president facing impeachment, and his judgment is obviously flawed. I mean, if he thinks that he can send Mike Pence over to Ankara, make a deal, and then it's wrapped up and he can get up and say, oh, yes, I did it, it's all done, finished, I think I'm skeptical. Perhaps
Absolutely.
Some others are.
Okay, let me add a bit of levity here. I mean, this letter should not have been trashed. Would you agree with me? I mean, I would have thought that this should be framed and kept for posterity as as an example of how not to write a letter. But that's besides the point. Here's the thing. Lindsey Graham is a close ally of President Trump. I mean, if Trump really wants to put his weight behind this deal, do you think that Lindsey Graham is going to go ahead and with the sanctions threat?
Confidence in Trump's foreign policy ability, to be very candid. If it's the Republicans in the Senate, who, by the way, are Trump's future, if the House impeaches President Trump, it goes to the Senate. He needs the support of Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, to be very candid about it. So I think the Lindsey Graham issue is very, very significant and is very impactful. So it means that it's kind of, we have Yogi Berra, the famous ball player here, used to say the game isn't over till it's over. I don't think this game is over. I certainly hope for peace in the area. I certainly hope there'll be a ceasefire. I certainly hope that all the parties will cooperate and fall into place. But I wouldn't be necessarily optimistic. I also think that there was really a misunderstanding on the part of public opinion and the media as to the connection of the YPG and the PKK. That point really didn't get across, and even in the points themselves, the 12 points, there's really no mention of that. It's sort of implicit here that there are terrorists, that's the term, but it's generically used to mean, I think, the YPG and ISIS. So even that is very amorphous. So I'm concerned about the details here. I'm also concerned about the pushback in the United States against President Trump in terms of his foreign policy capability and initiatives. About the letter, Ejaz, I would say that letter is problematic because, I mean, it just doesn't, when I read it the first time on the press, I thought it was a fake letter. I thought, I can't believe the president sent such a letter.
Yeah, but then the White House confirmed that this was a genuine letter. Mr. Dogantekin, you heard Dr. Meirowitz. He has some very interesting insights. What is your sense of the situation, especially in the sense that, you know, there are various other actors, state actors, that are not part of this deal, that would not want this deal to go through, that do not want Turkey to have a safe zone. So that puts a lot of pressure on Turkey. And as Dr. Meirowitz said, that there's also a lot of U.S. domestic politics, which means that Trump might not be able to, if he chose to put his weight behind this deal. So Turkey is likely to get bogged down in that area, in that event.
First off, thank you very much for having me in your program. I agree with Mr. Meirowitz on being optimistic about this outcome. I mean, I'm not optimistic as well, and I have different reasons. First of all, you are dealing with a terrorist group here, PKK-YPG. It is a designated terrorist organization, not only by Turkey, but also by the State Department of the United States in 1997, and by the European Union early 2000s. And it's a terrorist group that doesn't know anything other than terrorism. You know, they have carried out numerous suicide bombing attacks within Turkey and outside of Turkey at the borders. And I don't think they can commit to any kind of, ethical goals here. And also, we are dealing with a country, United States, that is 7,000 miles away, and that has admitted on the presidential level that they are dealing with this terrorist group. And President Trump has blamed Barack Obama, his predecessor, and said, you know, he has cut a deal with a terrorist group at the expense of Turkey. I mean, this is happening for the first time in world history, I guess. A sovereign state is admitting its ties to a designated terrorist group. And it's not designated by other countries. It's designated by the United States itself, and it admits its ties to this group. So this is very problematic. And I think from now on, at least what we have seen is, you know, Turkey showed its certainty, its clarity in going out and saying to the world that we are going to solve this problem. We want to create a safe zone for displaced millions of refugees, Syrians, especially in Turkey. We have an official number like 4 million. And Turkey has to solve this problem because it's calling for the safe zone since 2015 to really solve the problem, plight of Syrian people. Nobody cares about them right now. And it came to American attention only within the last 2 weeks when Turkey announced its operation. I mean, before then, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. There are millions of displaced people all over the world, especially in Turkey. And they never talked about Syria. I mean, they carried out operations in 7,000 miles away, and they don't call it an invasion, they don't call it an occupation, but somehow when Turkey announces this kind of military operations on its border, which we have like 1,000 kilometers of border with Syria, and all this terrorism is originating from this border, and we have all the legitimate rights to be concerned about national security. And, you know, other than the national security interests of Turkey, we have a desire to create a safe zone, a 30-kilometer safe zone on the border for the safe return of refugees. I mean, that's a noble goal, and I think European countries and United States should really rally behind Turkey to create this safe zone. This is
okay, Mr. Dogantekin, I will, for this moment, leave aside the use of the term terrorism because it's now become a very problematic term for various reasons, and we really don't have the time to discuss that. But given this invocation of national security, well, again, a very problematic concept, but I don't have the time to problematize it. But give me a sense of, as I asked in my question earlier, that while, as you say, Turkey has a right to pursue its national security interests, if the other state parties that obviously do not share Turkey's concept of its national security interests, they have their own respective national security interests, then Turkish military is likely to get bogged down. And if there is one lesson, one motif that runs through the history of war since before Vietnam, it is that states, when they go in and they get bogged down because, they operate among the people, among the populations. Now, does Ankara have a sense of how it's going to react to that kind of eventuality?
I mean, if you go out to thousands of miles away and, carry out unjustified wars based on unsubstantiated evidences like the U.S. did in Vietnam or the U.S. did in Iraq, then, of course, you will be bogged down because there is no legitimate cause for the invasion or occupation. But this is our border. We are here to stay. We were here for 1,000 years and we'll be here another 1,000 years, maybe more. So we have to, do these operations and strengthen our borders. You see what President Donald Trump is doing on the Mexican border, for example. They are building a huge wall to protect its borders. I mean, it is, and Mexicans are not carrying out any attacks.
But it is one thing to build a wall on your side of the border, quite another to actually go into another sovereign territory. That is problematic, you'll agree, under international law.
I mean, if Turkey was the first country to really get into Syria, then it would be a problematic issue. But Turkey is one of the last countries actually to carry out an operation. You see, France is in Syria, Iran is in Syria, Russia is in Syria, United States is in Syria. A lot of other countries in the name of the coalition against Daesh, ISIS is in Syria, tens of countries. And, questioning Turkey's presence in Syria is just funny at this moment because we have a 1,000-kilometer border with Syria, and there is legitimate concern out there.
There are legitimate concerns. That was Mr. Vakkas, Dogantekin speaking with us. Let me just hop over back to Dr. Meirowitz. Dr. Meirowitz, you talked about the domestic political scene. Walk us through the intricacies there in terms of how serious this impeachment business is, especially if it is also impacting the U.S. foreign policy.
Just like with Nixon, when Nixon was under impeachment threat, it affected his foreign policy. Nixon, by the way, was a very adept foreign policy president. President Trump is not, very clearly. He likes to fight in the sandlot. That's his idea. I thought that was very astute of you to pick up on that. But remember the point. Impeachment and his base getting reelected. You see, you have to listen to his rallies and to what he says in his rallies to understand when he speaks to his people who are going to vote for him that he wants to get reelected, what he says. He says, look, the Kurds are great people and the Turks are great people. And I love about can't avoid the letter at the end of the letter, and I was talking to another professor yesterday where he says, I will call you later. I mean, that is like a real estate guy saying to his real estate buddy, I'll get back to you later. This is the United States of America, a superpower. This is not a real estate transaction. No, about the impeachment, I think you will see from the flawed judgment of the president that impeachment is having the major impact, is the most significant impact. And the reaction, as I said before, of the Republicans is key because when Nixon gave it up and resigned, it's because the Republican senators came to him and said, you're finished. You've got to resign, or you're going to be impeached. And here again, we see military people. I think today there was an op-ed in the Times from a leading admiral. A number of the military leaders and others are looking at the way American foreign policy is being maintained. And the other point is the perception in the U.S., and I want to emphasize this, that the media and the public perception does not make the link between the PKK and the YPG. Regretfully, I was astonished in the Wall Street Journal editorial that the Wall Street Journal, which is a very Republican-oriented publication, said that the connection between the PKK and the YPG was exaggerated. I was really surprised. That is a failure of communication of your point. And I also think that what Turkey is trying to do here, and I understand what they're trying to do, and I see their point in the terms of what they're saying, that it's an existential threat to Turkey to have the PKK, YPG on their border. I get it. But you've got to bring that point across to elites, to public opinion. And that I don't think has been successfully done. So you have the two prongs here. Communication failure, but also domestic crisis and chaos in the presidency. We see it. Look at the president's behavior, not just the letter, the rallies, all these points. If you read these points, they really are a wish list, Ejaz. They're a wish list of what the parties want. It is not implemented because I would have thought they would have all sit at a table. Even Vietnam, they sat at a table when the shape of the table was an issue. You don't have anybody at the table here. You basically have Mike Pence taking a plane, going with Mike Pompeo and with Jim Jeffrey, meeting with President Erdogan, which is a perfectly good thing to do, agreeing to the ceasefire. The two parties agree with it. The U.S. is basically pulling out, is really not there in impacting this. So I'm concerned that what's the end game? How does it play out? What's the long term? Short term, ceasefire, very good. Stop the fighting, very good. Short term pause, permanent ceasefire, very good. But what happens now, as you say, in Syria? What's the status of the safe zone? What does it mean? I think it is very, very good idea to try to get the Syrian refugees back to Syria and to get Syria back in shape and have a constitutional committee. Are we doing that? Is that what we're going to be doing? If we're not doing that, then we're not looking at the long game. The long game is the stability of Syria and the people there and the suffering of the people. And I think that we're not really thinking about that. We're doing high politics. And again, I do agree with Turkey's sentiments, but I don't think that this agreement is going to have enough glue, especially when you've got Trump tweeting. Who knows? Maybe I didn't check. Maybe Trump has a new tweet now. Every few minutes he has a tweet.
Absolutely.
It's confusing.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. I have to wrap up this segment. Unfortunately, I've run out of time. But there are a number of issues considering, for instance, Turkey's desire to send the Syrian refugees back. Runs in the face of concepts like refoulement and the other intricacies, not just of international law, but also of realpolitik. But thank you so much, Dr. Mark Meirowitz, as always, for your insights. We shall take a short break here and return to discuss the growing woes of Indian economy. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. India has touted its economic progress and soft image as one of its great achievements. There's truth in that assertion. Former Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh is largely credited for getting the Indian economy out of what was once termed as the Hindu rate of growth. The current Prime Minister Narendra Modi, elected to a second term earlier this year, piggybacked on the promise of increased growth, smart cities, improved infrastructure, more jobs, etc. He already had a solid base on which to build further, but he seems to have squandered that. When he went into polls in 2019, the economic indicators were sliding. The economy has slid further, but he managed to return to power on a jingoistic Hindutva agenda. Several Indian economists have been issuing warnings. Let's hear two of them before we go further in discussion. The first is Professor Jayati Ghosh, who teaches economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the second clip is by the recent Nobel laureate, Dr. Abhijit Banerjee.
The Indian economy is in a situation where it's beyond worry. We are basically in the middle of a crisis. It's fairly evident that there's a massive deceleration. And even if you don't call it a recession, because technically speaking, GDP has to decline for 2 quarters before you get a recession, what we've got is such a big slowdown that it is affecting demand, it is affecting employment, it's affecting living standards, and it's creating an overall crisis which in any other country would be taken as a national emergency. In the last 1 year, what we've been seeing is that overall lack of demand, which has been really punishing the informal sector now for 3 years, has actually been also impacting the formal sector.
The National Sample Survey, which comes out every 1.5 years or so, and it gives you the average consumption in urban and rural areas in India. And the fact that we see in that is that between 2014-15 and 2017-18, that number has slightly gone down. And that's the first time such a thing has happened in many years. So that's a very glaring warning sign.
Let's now get to our panel. We are joined by Professor Surajit Mazumdar, who's Professor of Economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He joins us from Delhi, and Mr. Nasim, who is the CEO of RF Habib Consultancy, who deals with the real economy. Let me begin with Professor Mazumdar. Professor Mazumdar, what are the indicators here? There's also a sense of people saying that the government has been fudging figures. What is the real state of the economy?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to necessarily say that figures are being fudged, but there is certainly an issue about the fact that the government seems to be reluctant to address the method by which we are measuring our GDP. And perhaps, therefore, our actual growth situation is worse than what even the GDP figures are indicating. In part, the problem is that when the new GDP series was introduced in 2015, there are disputes or controversies about the methods being used in this new series. And there was a contention. The chief economic advisor of the previous government itself has come out with an estimate that actual GDP growth rate even till 2016-17 was only about 4.5% per annum, at least 2.5 percentage points less than what the GDP series was showing. Then you had the impact of demonetization and introduction of GST, which had a particularly adverse effect on the unorganized sector of the economy. Now, our GDP calculation methods do not have any way of capturing any exceptional effect on the unorganized sector. Since you measure the unorganized sector trend from the basis of some year figures, it's possible that the hit that the informal sector or the unorganized sector took because of demonetization GST was greater than what the GDP figures are showing. So it's quite possible that actual GDP growth rate, which now in the last quarter was 5%, could be much below that, closer to 2.5%.
Okay. Professor Mazumdar, another indicator would be the employment rates. Given that, generally it's being said that it's the highest in the last 45 years, there's a certain number X that India has to add into its job market every year, and for that it has to grow at the various figures that are thrown around from 8 to 10% over a period of the next 10 to 15 years. Now, using that indicator, what do you think is the state right now?
So essentially, I would say that the first crisis that the Indian economy is experiencing is, for a long period of time, is the agrarian crisis, which is that the sector which traditionally employs a large section of the population is no longer able to sustain that population. So there is a large-scale movement taking place outside agriculture in search of work outside agriculture. So in addition to the increase in the population, you have also this increase in the number of people looking for work outside agriculture. And in the absence of adequate employment opportunities, what you have is a situation where large percentage of the population are stuck in a situation where they simply are not able to achieve any increases in their income. Even if they get work in highly productive activities, the labor market is such that there is such a large surplus labor available that there is a downward pressure on the wages. So 90% of the population is stuck at extremely low levels of income. And because of that, you have an extremely narrow market, which is not compensated by an ability to export on any significant scale. So an extremely narrow market is not allowing the economy to grow on a sustained basis because there isn't simply enough demand available to sustain that growth. So we've already had earlier a situation where investment, construction and such activities had slowed down and had been slowed down almost a decade ago. Export growth has also slowed down for almost a decade. So you already had this situation where there was this slowing down. You were basically being able to grow only on the basis of consumption growth of a small section of the population. But the small section of the population also earning business incomes, their ability to generate that incomes also depends on their existing a market outside. With such a large portion of the population essentially out of the market, you don't have a situation on the basis of which even many smaller businesses and all can generate profits and income. And so their demand is also now collapsing, and that's the effect that we are seeing. So that's why you see from things like cars, which are purchased by a very small section of the Indian population, to 5 rupee biscuit packets, which are purchased by extremely low income groups. In the whole range, you are finding that firms are not able to find enough market for the products that they're producing. And this is aggravating the problem, because as the demand is collapsing, the employment is coming down. As employment is coming down, more and more people, the jobless problem is increasing. As the joblessness is increasing, the demand problem is also becoming more and more severe.
I'm sure your students must evaluate you very highly, Professor Mazumdar, because that was a very lucid explanation of what's happening. But give me a sense of, since you said that the economy had started slowing down for almost a decade now, Narendra Modi, in the last 5 years, the first tenure, he came to power on an agenda which had a lot to do with how he's going to essentially increase growth and improve infrastructure and the rest of it. But that did not really happen. And this time, in the run-up to the elections, he basically used Pakistan and the rest of it you already know to get his votes. Do you think that he has actually focused on the economy to the extent that he promised that he would or that he should have?
Well, I think there is a focus on the economy. I just don't think it's the right focus.
Okay.
The focus has been on, say, introducing reform measures like introduction of GST, which was not the priority for the economy like India. Even today, the focus is on, say, improving the ease of doing business, reduction of corporate taxes. But this is the wrong focus, because essentially the problem is that if you have a growth in the Indian economy and the growth takes place under circumstances when 90% of the population is not able to derive any benefit from it, then that growth process is always going to run into problems, because it has a very narrow base. And unless you're willing to address that problem, you're not really going to be able to address this issue in any fundamental sense. Now, addressing that problem at the minimum requires that you use your powers of taxation and spending in some way to redistribute the incomes which are distributed highly unequally by the working of the economic system. But if instead you are focused on making it easy for private capital, giving them tax concessions, and not spending very much, then you're not going to be able to address the problem. So I think the problem is that the single-minded focus is on making it easier for private capital to invest and drive your economy. That focus is continuing despite the fact that for 10 years you've seen evidence that private investment is not being able to drive the economy. And in conditions that we face today, where demand is collapsing, it's ridiculous to expect that private investors will suddenly start spending heavily. They already have capacities which they are not being able to utilize. They are not going to create on their own. So it is the responsibility of the government to first do things which will lead to an expansion of demand. Then private investment can follow. Unfortunately, the focus is on somehow ensuring that you don't spend. The one thing that the government is very clear about, it is not going to be increasing its public spending. And if that is the focus, then I believe that's an entirely wrong focus.
That is an entirely wrong focus. That was Professor Surajit. Mr. Beg, I have some data here which says India's industrial production shrinks to minus 1.1% in August. And it says the data released by Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has revealed that the index of industrial production shrank by 1.1 in August compared with an expansion of 4.3% in July. Can you put this in English? What exactly does this mean?
It simply means that, for example, they are selling significantly lesser cars in India. Therefore, they can't produce more cars when the showrooms are shutting down because of excess inventories, etc. So it's basically that, or they're not selling enough washing machines or refrigerators or whatever else. And I think the underlying problem is, which is not just India, but we see it in this side of the border as well, that we tend to at times follow the methods they've used in the developed countries, while those developed countries are at a different stage of economic history or their development of economic history. For example, India has a heavy sales tax or a GST or whatever they call it. So recently their government announced reduction in corporate income tax, a significant one, but the consumer who would have to go out and buy things and create demand is being crushed by that sales tax. So it's really a structural flaw in the thinking, and I would say whether here or there, when you start imposing sales tax on a poor population, if I'm not wrong, the good 90% of the Indians survive at less than 10,000 Indian rupees per month. Now, when people are at that level, you don't impose taxes on their consumption. So that is what's hurting that economy. And let me add in here, their finance minister's own husband, who's an economist, feels that the government is in denial of this thing. Their former governor of the central bank feels that the economy is being run out of the prime minister's office. Now, it's a huge country. You can't do those things. So really, at the end of the day, it's the consumer demand, which means the pocket of the poor person, the average consumer, that needs to be looked after. And since it's not been done, giving tax relief to the corporate sector is not going to help them.
You talked about the irony of the husband of the Indian finance minister, the husband being an economist himself, saying that, has taken the government to task. Now, Professor Mazumdar said that there is a focus, but there's a wrong focus. Additionally, Indian government has been very belligerent, tensions have increased in South Asia. Do you think that improvement in the economy and warmongering and this kind of jingoistic sloganeering can go together?
It's not sustainable. The point is that the entire subcontinent has this 90% or more people living in poverty. It's doing no one any good to be in an issue of warmongering, etc. All of us need to work together towards peaceable coexistence and fixing the problem of the abject poverty that we have in the subcontinent. I think any leadership that thinks otherwise is doomed. I mean, we're just headed for trouble.
Since you deal with real economy, these indicators, if the focus is not shifted to where it should be, then 6 months down the line, how do you think the situation is going to unfold for the Indian economy?
See, it'll only multiply, because when you have factories that are functioning to half capacity or have to shut down, lay off people, so you are taking away from the purchasing power. People who have been laid off obviously lose their purchasing power altogether. Others because there are new, younger people coming into the market. They don't get jobs, so there are more mouths to feed, and yet you don't have breadwinners. So at the end of the day, it'll only get worse. I mean, I can't put an exact timing on whether it's 6 months or 8 months or a year, but the trend is very clear that you can only go downhill unless you fix this. And I think Professor Mazumdar is I think got it absolutely right. You've got to look after the spending power of the poor people. You've got to put money into their pockets. That is the only way forward. Spending on military hardware, doing things like that is not going to do anything for the economy.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Nasim Beg speaking with us. This is all we have from Indus Special this week. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.